Hi everyone. As you're coming in, I would love if you would put your name and the university you're coming from. Also, are you a BSW or MSW student? I'm always curious to see which ones come into the conference. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone has been having a wonderful time today. I was actually the lead organizer last year, so I totally empathize with everyone who has been planning this. So glad I'm not doing it this year. But if anyone here is on the planning team, shout out to you guys. You guys are doing a phenomenal job. And I hope after this, you can breathe a sigh of relief. Oh, thank you, Nicole. That's so sweet. And I'm so glad you're here again this year. We love folks who come every year. Um, wow, we have a good range of folks coming in from Tennessee, Columbia, Howard, and a mix of BSW and MSW students. That's so great to see. Wassalam, Altaf. So good you're here. So I'm going to get started. I'll give a quick introduction to who I am, and then I'll give an overview of what I'm talking today. But I really want a lot of the time today to be more of a Q&A session because I'm sure everyone is just a little burnt out from hearing folks speak, and I would love if I could be of help and help you answer any questions. So an introduction. Hi, my name is Noshin Hogue. I use the pronoun she, hers, and I am the policy coordinator for a nonprofit in New York City called RISE. And RISE is a nonprofit which follows an abolitionist framework. So we are an abolitionist organization and we are parent-centered. We are also parent-led, and we advocate for a transformative change within the family policing system, also known as the child welfare system. And although I won't be going deep into the harms of the family policing system, if anyone is interested or has an interest in it, always just email me. I'll put my email at the end and you can always reach out because I think we need a lot more social workers advocating for change. A lot of the work that I do is around policy within New York City and New York State. So right now with the state budget advocacy going around in New York State, a lot of my time is revolved around meeting with legislators and harassing them and telling them you need to put money towards, what we care about. And my focus is divesting money from the family policing system and putting it more into community support and community programs that are completely led by folks on the ground rather than folks from a government department. So that's currently what I do right now. I graduated with my MSW from Columbia last year, so shout out to students who are from Columbia. I specialize in public policy, and I actually got my BSW from Stony Brook University. Quick detail about me, I always knew that I was going to be going into policy. I never had any interest in the clinical side of social work, but yes, I agree, and more money for social workers. But there's so much value as a clinical social worker to still be relevant and active on the more macro and policy side. So what will I be talking about today? Today, I really want to connect theory to practice. So I know we've heard so much about why social workers should run for office, why social workers need to be more active on the political field and in public policy, which I want to echo what everyone has been saying. But I really want to connect what we're learning in class and what we're learning in our internship more into how it plays out, and also highlighting some ways, some different pathways you can take to really get involved into policy. I think some of the ways that we think generally that we can get involved is by one, running for office, which I encourage everyone to do, and getting involved in a campaign. But social workers play a much deeper role, regardless of whether you're running for office or working for campaigns. I work with social workers who are working on all different levels of government, and we all play a very integral role in making public policy changes. So what I really want to do is highlight two different paths that we can take as social workers to get our feet wet into the policy field and really make a career out of it. And I identify two pathways. One being you can be a political social worker, and that's what I talked about before. You're running for office or you're a social worker helping someone win for office. And I would also include being a staff member for an elected official. I consider all of that on the political side. And then the other side, really getting involved into public policy, is on the government side, where you're representing a nonprofit, which is what I currently do, and you're representing community members and you're advocating to elected officials for public policy changes. So those are really the two pathways I see as social workers we can really get involved in public policy. I think we've heard a lot today about how social workers can get involved in the campaign part. And to connect some of the things we learn in class, we know that as social workers, we have a better and deeper understanding of social injustices and social justices and how it relates to system issues. What I see on my day to day is that we're really good at making sure we connect our clients' every day-to-day experience to public policy. So we know DV services are underfunded. We know prisons are too heavily funded. But as social workers, we know how that translates on the day-to-day life. So if we know that DV services, domestic violence services, are underfunded, we see how DV survivors don't have a lot of funding for stable housing. It's harder to get out of a lease. It's harder to get access to services without getting involved with, a court case with their abuser, et cetera, et cetera. So we understand how, broader issues really connect in the day-to-day life. And that helps when you're helping someone campaign, because every candidate has a good broad sense of what's going on, but they really lack the understanding of how it relates on the day-to-day. So that's on the campaign side. Now, what does a social worker look like when you're representing a nonprofit? And I want to say it's a lot harder on the nonprofit side, or if you're working as a political social worker for communities and nonprofits rather than elected officials. And it's because we don't just do a lot of public policy work, we do a lot of organizing work at the same time. And when I was a student, we would learn about organizing. We would learn about, like how to get funding, how to write grants, but I never really understood the intersection between public policy and political advocacy and organizing. But as a social worker who works for an organization, and I'm working and coordinating with legislators, working to get the budget change for things that we're interested in, there's so much more organizing involved, because we want to make sure that folks who are impacted by the issues are at the front and center. And that's what I think really makes a distinction between working for the government, advocating to elected officials, and working with elected officials. And I, as someone who works for nonprofit, I think it's a lot harder to be doing the organizing and policy work. And I didn't include this before, but my background isn't just with working for nonprofits. I used to work for legislator Kara Han, who was a legislator in Long Island. And I also campaigned for candidate Mahfouz al-Islam in New York City when he was running for assemblyman. So I have a lot of experience on the campaigning side, on the staffing side, and the nonprofit side. And it's a lot harder as a social worker to take that organizing skill and then also integrate it into policy. But I see a lot more value in social workers doing that. And I'll give an example, because I think examples are the best way to communicate this. Um, right now, New York City put down at least $1 million to fund family enrichment centers. It's actually not 1 million. I don't have the right number in my mind, but for this example, we'll put $1 million. What are family enrichment centers? Family enrichment centers are centers that are going to be designed by community members for the community. So if the community decides we need a place for events to be hosted outside of schools, that is for easy access and open on the weekends, if we want more parent cafe nights, if we want more movie nights for the community, for the children to be involved in, that's what the Family Enrichment Center will be. It is completely for the community, by the community. Conceptually, that sounds amazing. But we as social workers know that everything isn't just working in a silo, everything is working in systems interconnecting. So although conceptually this sounds good, we're actually advocating to not implement family enrichment centers. And you guys might be wondering why. We're for the community, right? Well, it's because FECs are actually under the family policing system, also known as the child welfare system. FECs are going to be under ACS, which is the department within New York City that helps implement all the laws, regulations, and surveils children and families in New York City. And so even though the concept is good, it's funded and run by an oppressive system. And that's something social workers will be more keen to and be able to identify, rather than folks who have a degree in law, folks who have a degree in public policy, just as is, and folks who have another degree. We understand and we learn how to see how systems connect and how that impacts us and our clients and our community that we serve on a day-to-day life. So even though FEC sounds good on paper, we wouldn't be advocating for it because it's run by an oppressive system. And all oppressive systems have a history of oppression. And so even if what they're implementing is good, it doesn't mean you're going to be removing the root causes of harms that they've caused communities for generations. And that's how a social worker helps. I'm a social worker. I work in policy. My boss is a social worker, but and she's working on policy. But out of the two of us, we don't see enough other social workers when we work with other organizations really knee deep into the policy part of things. And so when we saw that FECs were being funded and everyone was just like, this is an amazing idea, we already knew that if it's funded by the oppressor, we don't want it. We're trying to divest power and money away from systems and put it into communities without having that relationship and that conditional relationship with systems. And that's one of the values of being a social worker on the government's, on the advocacy side of things, as well. And then on the political side, I'll give an example of how social workers are really valuable. And what we learn is, I'm sure in class we've learned how to do cost budget analysis or policy memos if you're specializing in policy. That's really what I learned. Stacey is asking, what if the system is attempting to make positive change? That's a good question, Stacey, and that's something that we're always struggling with, because you're right. If you think about it, family enrichment centers are still good. It's a place for families and children to get support without having to enter the system, like they're getting that peer support that they might not get, and they're getting that social communication, social interaction that right now the pandemic has really taken away from us. But if you think about it, if it's funded by ACS and the child welfare system, that means there's going to be a lot more folks who are mandated reporters. And that's a whole tangent on the harms of mandated reporting. But there's also their names and their information is going to be under under ACS. And so ACS, even if they're just funding these FECs, they're collecting information on these families. And FECs are being placed in the communities that have a historic um, have traditionally been investigated by ACS. So these are communities where generations of families have gone through the child welfare system. They've had investigations done daily. And so now you're putting a program that's now under the surveilling system and putting it in these communities that are already highly impacted and already highly investigated. And it's sort of putting a label on them as, you have a high rate of investigation. We're going to put this program, collect your information, and you're going to be under our surveillance. So even if the idea is making positive change, if you're going to be doing with an oppressive system, oppressive practices will always come out. That's sort of what RISE has seen. And so why we're always trying to divest power away from the systems and put it directly into communities. Because if you want a community program, why do you need it to be under a government institution? Why can't it just be funded directly to community leaders rather than going through a system, if that makes sense? But you're right. I mean, it's a question we struggle with every day because it's not easy to pass policies without going to a system. The funding can come from the government, but it doesn't have to be regulated and overseen by a department under the government, if that makes sense. You can have, yeah, I'm not sure what NGO means, and I would love if you could explain that a bit further. Yes, community-led power. Non-governmental organization. Yeah, sort of that concept. And it does exist, New York City has community organizations that are funded by the government, but you don't have that oversight and that you're not under a department. You get your stream of funding from the government, but there's no regulation such as you have to follow this law and you have to make sure we're bringing in this many families, which does happen when you're under um, like a department's oversight, such as ACS. And that's a struggle with social workers. I think we know that social workers often work in systems that are oppressive. For example, CPS, we all know the stereotype where, like social workers work for CPS and we're taking children away. And we know that's not true, but it also doesn't mean that we're not working in oppressive systems and working to make change within the system, which often can be more harmful than beneficial. But to go back to the topic of, other ways to get involved in policy. So this was the example of really getting into the weeds of, working in policy for a nonprofit and for other organizations. The other part is working for a campaign or running for office yourself. And I'll talk about my experience for working on a campaign. A lot of the candidates that I've seen, especially when Mahfouzal was running for assembly, for a position in the state assembly for New York State, is that people have a good sense of the broad issues. So we know that, for example, in New York State, we put way too much funding into prisons and not enough funding into stable housing for New York State. We also know we don't put enough funding towards childcare. These are some of the big issues going around in New York State that my organization Rise is advocating for. But a lot of candidates who understand this broad issue don't really understand how it translates on the day to day. And if you can't translate how not enough funding for childcare translates to folks actually on the ground, you don't really have a good sense of what the issue is really doing and how it's impacting us. And that's where social workers come in. We have a mindset and a better way of understanding how to connect it to. And I say this because I've worked with folks who aren't social workers. They may be organizers, they may be folks who have a degree in law. And so they know what the words mean, they know what the implementation means, but they don't really know how to connect the essence and like the dignity of folks and the humanity really into it. And that's a value that I brought into the campaign when I worked, and that's what I've seen other social workers do as well, especially when you're running for office. A lot of elected officials that I've worked with, especially on the state level, do not have, they have this disconnect from what it means, from what the issues are, and what it actually means in real life. And I'll give the example of childcare. A lot of state elected officials understand that we need money towards childcare. One of the leading causes for parents to get a neglect case is because they don't have childcare. But folks who think about childcare think, oh, like, working parents need this, so we need to fund universal childcare. But what some of the real issues is that parents need childcare because one, they can't get a job unless they have a place to put their child in. A lot of parents who aren't just working white collar jobs, but are working night shifts, they're working construction jobs, they're working labor jobs. Those have odd hour shifts, and childcare centers aren't open then. And so we need centers that are open and accessible for everyone, not just folks who work a certain type of job. Folks who are in office right now don't really understand that. So we as social workers really have to connect what the real problems are into it. And I think when Dr. Shannon Lane was speaking, someone in the comment actually said, yes, we need to start connecting human stories to issues. And as intuitive as it sounds, it does not happen often enough in government. I especially see it right now when we're doing the state budget advocacy and advocating for $5 billion for childcare. People don't really understand how it really connects to our day-to-day life experience, and elected officials genuinely don't understand it unless you spell it out for them, because there is a disconnect. And that's where social workers have played an integral part in mobilizing and organizing community members to advocate and making that connection for them. um, and I want to take a pause here to see if there's any questions, thoughts. I wish I could see you guys' faces. It's always a little daunting when it's just me on the screen. I agree, Bridget. The system does need a complete reform. New York State has a very harmful system. Ava had said a lot of the issues are related to the punitive system and its biased discriminatory nature. The focus is typically on punishment and not care for the survivors. That's a very consistent theme you'll see in a lot of social justice issues. It's with the child welfare system, it's with the criminal justice system. You'll see it with access to housing. We always punish the folks who need the support the most. And Anne, I really do want to echo what you're saying. People don't like to speak up after seeing how people were treated at school board meetings. You're so right. And I don't just mean school board meetings. I mean, a part of my job is to empower impacted parents who went through the system to speak up and share their stories. But it's really hard when you're in a room that's almost consistently usually majority white folks who don't understand what you're saying, and you've always been treated as the person who made the mistake rather than a result of the conditions of society. And so it becomes really hard to testify. And we see it all the time. And our job as social workers is really to make sure that we're empowering folks, especially folks who are impacted, and making sure their stories are heard. Bridget, I'll give a quick introduction again because I see a lot more folks have joined. I am a policy coordinator at Rise, which is a nonprofit in New York City where we advocate for a transformative system that's investing in community supports rather than investing more into the child welfare system, which we call the family policing system. And empowerment is crucial. And it's actually one of the hardest parts of the job, though, is making sure that what we know, we're translating it to the folks who are impacted, because trauma does a lot on a lot of folks, and it means it becomes that much harder to really find your voice again. And people can always pass policies without centering the folks who are impacted. It is so easy to advocate and pass policies when you're just the only one working, and you're not actually bringing along with you the folks who are impacted and making sure their voices are heard. It happens all the time. And so as social workers, we have to make sure their voices are being centered. Yeah, I can. So as a policy coordinator, one of my main roles is to make sure that Rise's policy priorities are centered and heard within the state budget and during like with state elected officials and the city. So right now, New York State is actually under process for finalizing their state budget. So we've spent a lot of our time advocating for $5 billion to be invested in childcare. And so my role is to make sure that parents are connected to elected officials, that Rise's priorities are heard within the state budget, and then working alongside other organizations in New York State who are advocating for the same things as us. So coordinating coalition meetings, joining those, and always bringing parents into it. Some of our current policy priorities, as I mentioned, one is to invest more into childcare and advocate for universal childcare. Part of it includes making childcare respite or like drop off emergency childcare centers a thing. We want mandated reporter to be completely changed, and we want mandated supporting instead of mandated reporting, because a lot of folks just need support. They don't need an investigation. And our third one is investing in peer support programs. How can we enter policy work as minorities without becoming tokenized? That's a really hard question, because it is hard. And I'm not an impacted parent, but I am working for an organization that's led by impacted parents, and more than half of our staff is impacted parents, but I work on the policy. So what I really do to make sure that I come from a place that's informed is at every coalition meeting, at every committee meeting, at every meeting I have with an elected official, I take parents with me and I have them speak, and I do more of the background work. So I find the data, I find what if we're meeting with, for example, Chairman Hevesi, I find out what his interests are, what he's done the work for, and really making sure they're prepped to speak and that they feel empowered to speak their mind without feeling like they're not allowed to talk. Are you aware of other organizations in other states that do similar work? I know nationally we have Movement for Family Power, who does a lot of the same work Rise does, but on the federal level. But I really work more with the state and city. And I have to say, I see a lot more social workers on the state level, but I don't see enough social workers on the city level. So always get involved in the local parts, because I think one, it's easier to see the change and advocate for change on the more local level, and two, your voices is going to be heard more easily. To be transparent, the state is a who knows who game. Like, you have to have the network, you have to have the connections. If you don't have that it becomes so much harder to be in the right meetings at the right time. And I really struggled as a social worker to make sure that they recognize that my knowledge on policy and my knowledge on what needs to be heard is valid, because I work with other lawyers, I work with other disciplines, and people really think that lawyers have a better understanding of the social justice issues, when in reality they might have a good understanding, but social workers really have a good understanding of how it's impacting us on a more day-to-day level, and really connecting it to the broader issue. Sometimes in wanting your voice to be heard to an audience that may not understand your perspectives, how do you find methods to help encourage parents, community members to voice their issues? That is a really great question, Barbara. Some of the tools we use is we hold trainings and workshops before we have a big testimony or hearing coming up. So, for example, yesterday, New York City had a budget hearing on the budget for ACS, the Administration for Children's Services, which is New York City's child welfare agency. So obviously we wanted parents to speak up at this budget. So what we did before we have them speak is go through a workshop of, what are some like speaking skills, what are some presentation skills, what is it that you want to see the budget include, and what do you want to call out that ACS has done that has harmed you in the past. And really taking the time and the patience to talk through it and make sure that what they're sharing, they feel comfortable with. Because what I've seen a lot is that folks really want their stories to be heard and their trauma to be emphasized, but folks might still be processing and healing from that trauma, and making sure that what they're doing is what they're comfortable with and not pushing them to like fulfill your agenda, which can happen often, and it's really hard. And so making sure that we take the process to have them heal and share the story at the same time, which is what social workers are really good at. We can help folks heal and process and still know how to advocate for it. Can a clinical track student successfully enter policy and government, or would you recommend switching to macro social work concentration? Um, I don't know if I'm the best to answer that because I have always done policy. In my BSW program, I interned for a legislator. During my MSW, I did my internship with CRISP, and then I just went straight into policy. But I will say my co-executive director is a social worker who wasn't a clinical student, but she specialized in organizing. So really how to mobilize communities and organize them and make sure they're centered and empowered. And then it was easy for her to transition into policy because a lot of policy work is mobilizing. You can think of what law to fix, but to make sure the law is passed, you have to mobilize. And a clinical student has a direct relationship with the folks, on the ground. You have your clients, so you have one half of the job done. The second part is just knowing how to mobilize your clients to feel empowered. I hope that answered your question. Any other questions? How does a master's in public administration and MSWs differ? I don't think I can answer that effectively because I'm not sure what the curriculum looks like for an MPA. I just know what the curriculum looks like for an MSW and if you're specializing in public policy. Um, Yeah, I think Chelsea answered that better. But I will say some of the things we learned in our MSW, we learned the narrative of strength-based, knowing how to frame issues from a strength-based perspective. We know how to connect systems together and that nothing works in a silo. And we also know how to really create an environment where folks feel included and safe. And those are skills that I thought like, oh, like that's really going to be beneficial for the clinical work. But it's really, really beneficial if you're working on the policy level because we're almost always working against the flow. People usually don't want the more progressive and the more radical change. People really want the easy change, the ones that are reforming the symptom and not the root cause of the issue. And so knowing how to navigate conversations with people who might not agree with you is really difficult. And especially when you're having a conversation where you guys are clashing, it can get really emotional and riled up, especially in government. You'd be surprised. And so knowing how to navigate those conversations and make the person feel heard, but also have your point communicated is really important. Could you speak to how this kind of policy work through nonprofits is funded and what evaluation measure results donors expect to see? Oh, I can go on a tangent about this. So my organization is funded by the city of New York. So we are funded by the government and but we also have a lot of grants. We have the New York Women's Foundation who funds us, and we have the New York Community Trust, and all of these funders have different expectations. And a lot of these expectations require meeting very specific deliverables, especially for nonprofits who want to do policy work, because we aren't technically allowed to lobby. We're not allowed to lobby whatsoever. And so we have to wait until folks are elected into office to set up meetings with them. And some of the best ways to make policy change is while people are campaigning, because you can really provide sponsorships, provide them the support while they campaign, and make a negotiation that we're helping you connect with these many folks from your community. And then when you're into office, you're going to advocate for our issues. Nonprofits aren't really allowed to do that because we can't lobby like that. And so it really makes us think about how else we can make sure our issues are heard after they're elected into office. So one of the tools that nonprofits really use and like we measure is how do you build relationships with elected officials after they're elected into office. And so donors want to see us being a resource to elected officials. So what we did after New York City Council members were elected this year is make resource packets. Social workers are really good at doing community assessments and identifying which services and resources are provided within the community. That's actually exactly what elected officials want as a resource for them. They want to know, they can do the work, but they love it if other people can do it for them. So we do the work of identifying, you have this many preventative services in your program. This is the poverty poverty rate for your district. This is how many ACS investigations are happening, and these are how many investigations are substantiated. And we give them a breakdown of what their community looks like right after they're elected and become a resource for them. That's usually how I've seen a lot of nonprofits build a relationship with elected officials and start to, like pave the path into, well, we became a resource for you. This is what you really need to focus on if you want to do some good for your community. And donors really like to see you building relationships and having a very active relationship with them. Can you clarify the difference between advocating and lobbying? They're really the same thing, but I think lobbying you can do without the constraints of, are they already elected into office? Also, I think you have to get like a specific certification to be to be like a lobbyist. But when lobbyists go meet with folks one-on-one, and when advocates go meet on one-on-one, the platform and the procedure is really the same. Have your issues ready to talk about, have the specific information already ready, like make sure you understand how to follow up with them, make sure they understand what you're putting out on the table. The framework's really the same, but the lobbyists have less constraints than advocates from a nonprofit do. Melanie, I'm going to take some time to read yours, but I'm just going to skip to see if I can answer anything. Once we are waiting for safe childcare. Do you think emails such as these are still just as impactful or personalized messages for those reading? I do think personalized messages are helpful. In my experience, when you're sending out a generic email that like everyone with the same text, folks on the other side, such as staffers, I've actually done this when I was a staffer for Legislator Khan, where you just filter out the emails that have the same text message because you got the message after one time. I think repeated messages like this are much more helpful when you're doing it on Twitter or social media, because you can tag them and they can't really censor that. So using the same text over and over again on Twitter and social media is a lot more effective. If you're going to be emailing, going the personalized route is so much more effective, and having one-on-one outreach is so much better. But you're right, our clients are overwhelmed, and having a pre-filled email is easier. We're also guilty of it. We have pre-filled emails, and we encourage folks, like personalize it, put in your own story, and make sure that the email that they're receiving can't filter out your email, but it's not always the case. So it's really just assess the situation, read the room, and figure out which one do you think will be better. I think on the more local level, they tend not to filter out messages and emails that are all the same, and they will just like keep track of like, oh, like 70 people sent us the same email. We should really be looking at it. But in my experience with on the congressional level, they get a bunch of emails every day, like an insane amount, and so getting 70 emails of the same thing might not always make them care, and having that one-on-one outreach might be more impactful. So recognizing which level of advocacy you're doing as well. Ava said, I imagine it's become more difficult to engage using an abolitionist framework with New York City's new mayor. Oh, you have no idea. How do you convince those who are invested in upholding a harmful current systems? We're still actually working that out because it is a new administration, and a part of us doesn't know, should we build relationships or should we just go, like on the opposite stance and just, like push through with our abolitionist framework. What we really are strategizing right now is how do we use the new mayor's framework to our benefit? So the new mayor is saying that he doesn't believe systems work in a silo. We also at Rise don't believe systems work in a silo. They are always working together. There's always, like interdisciplinary actions, all of those things. Departments work together all the time. And he believes that departments should be used to support one another. We at Rise agree that other systems should be supporting, and ACS, which is a system used to surveil and like investigate families, shouldn't be in charge of childcare. It makes no sense that the system that is separating families from children should also be offering childcare. And so we use his framework of, system support systems to say that another system should take over childcare and not put it under ACS. And so really listen closely to what they say and try to use their words to push your narrative. But yes, being an abolitionist in this administration is hard, but not impossible. Especially in New York City, you have a lot more progressive organizations that will be rallying with you. Having coalitions is really important in policy work. I know, like, you might be just working to push your policy priorities for your organization, but having coalitions makes your work 10 times easier, especially in policy, because your network expands, access to other elected officials that you might not have a relationship expands, and the power of, like, numbers plays a huge role in advocacy as well. That's how the childcare funding is making moves. Government Hochul in New York State had first initially proposed $900 million towards childcare. And then through our Empire State Coalition and through so many other organizations in New York State advocating for investing in childcare, now, there's a huge significant chance that investment in childcare will increase into the billions. I mean, it's not guaranteed so far. The finalized budget will come out on Monday, but so many parents, providers, daycare centers have been advocating for it, and there's talks about it expanding. So it helps, a lot. It sounds like your job draws heavily on relational and communication skills. Do you do much in terms of analyzing, drafting policies, or is it more advocacy and organizing to get existing policies? It's actually both. So I write policy briefs, policy memos. I help with the cost budget analysis to recognize, like, what's the realistic expectations of, like, passing childcare. What does it mean for jobs within the childcare center? What does it mean for salaries? All of those things. And then policy memos is really, having your list of recommendations, and doing like a pros, con, and giving the context of the problem in those memos. So I do that, but that's just the written part. That's like the operational part of changing policy. You still have to do the organizing part to make sure that your policy recommendations are heard and that there's, like, a lot of people behind your recommendations. So it's a bit of both. Even though my role is to just do memos, it's not going to get passed unless you have the organizing part of it. Any advice for writing policy briefs? Practice, practice, practice. My first policy brief was when I was doing it for an assignment in Colombia, and I got so much feedback from my professor saying, like, we like I think one of the tips is the shorter the better. A lot of folks don't actually want to read a lot of context, and so know how to frame your issue in 2 to 3 sentences and have really good data points. People would rather see numbers as to why your issue matters rather than just an explanation of why is this an issue, all of that. Like, have the numbers. So for example, like, we show that over the pandemic the number of childcare vouchers dropped from 65,000 to 46,000. Everyone needed childcare during the pandemic, especially when things started reopening and childcare centers had started closing down because of the pandemic. We needed more childcare centers, and having that number really helps us show, like, you need to be investing in childcare, and that catches their attention 10 times more quickly than having a whole spiel on, like, childcare centers do this for families and, like, that for families. It's actually really important to have the context, but when there's a time crunch and they only have 2 minutes to listen to you, having data points is so much easier. And briefs, if they're reading it, making it as short as possible sometimes helps a lot more. Are briefs better as a paragraph format or bullets? I think either or is fine. I do bullets. When I write my policy briefs, I do bullets because it's easier for me to visualize what I'm saying and assume that the person reading it can visualize it better as well. We don't use graphics. We just keep our logo and then we just do the briefs. We don't do different fonts, but we bold the recommendations, and the context for the recommendations are not bolded. So things we want them to see quickly, we bold, but we try to keep it as minimal noise in the background as possible. And keeping it to 1 to 2 pages has been helpful. But I also want to, like, just clarify, like, this is from my experience, and I know for a fact that different folks might have a different experience. And I also work in New York City and New York State, and the politics and the demographic of folks who are more progressive rather than conservative is also very different. We're advocating with a different set of folks than you might be in California, not California, but like Carolina or Georgia or anything like that. Know your demographic. And thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that. I would also say for any folks who are doing or learning how to do a cost budget analysis or is taking an economics class, pay attention because I never really understood the connection between economics and social work, but in our day-to-day life, like, it impacts us a lot, and it impacts the issues we're advocating for. I would never think there was a connection, but there was. And when I started my job, I had to refresh a lot of what I knew about economics to make sure that I really understood what was going on. Any other questions? You guys have been asking really great ones. It's making me like think back to my class too. Can you give us an example of a cost budget analysis? Yes, I can. I'll actually take it back to last year when we were advocating for removing SROs, which are school resource officers, from schools and putting more money into social workers in schools and nurses and guidance counselors. And when you're advocating for that, you really want to highlight the benefit of removing SROs and what are the costs that are associated with having an SRO in schools, and what will be the costs and the benefits when you're putting school social workers and nurses and those things into schools. And so we highlighted that when SROs into office are in schools, the rate of arrest becomes higher. And so we pull data on the cost of an arrest, how much it puts on tax folks, what is the salary for an SRO? What are the salaries for school social workers? For every one school social worker, you'll probably need like 3 SROs because, people really center safety, and really highlighting the difference and showing that it's a better investment to have social workers in schools rather than police officers. I did this last year, so I'm not sure of like the specific numbers, but it's really comparing the benefit of cost between the two issues. Did you understand policy in the courses right away, or did it take time? Oh my God, no, I did not understand it. I felt like it took me the 2 years in my BSW and then the 1 year that I did in my advanced MSW class to even get the grasp of what does policy and social work mean. And even then, I didn't really understand it until you're on the job and doing it. When I started my internship at CRISP, and when I started doing my internship at the legislator's office, is when I got a much better understanding of what I'm learning in class. I would say take every advantage to do an internship or something in real life so that it's easier to understand what you're learning in class. Because theory is harder to understand, in my opinion, unless you have like an example of implementation that you're doing yourself. Yes, restorative justice in schools now. I agree. Oh, is there a Q&A tab? I did not see that. Thank you for pointing that out. Sometimes I get confused on what the jobs are literally called. For social workers who are hoping to get into political advocacy, what do we put in the search bar? This is a really great question. I would say put policy coordinator, policy analyst, policy associate, anything with the word policy in it. I think you'd get a better chance than just putting. I mean, you really would not get any policy related jobs if you put social work. But I put, like, when I started searching for my jobs related to policy, I just put coordinator, analysis, associate, and you get a lot of results from that. So I would suggest putting those in the search tabs. And also sometimes if you put an advocacy coordinator or anything with the word advocacy, if you look at the job description, it also relates to policy too. So really putting in words related to policy might help you as well. Do you have any advice for finding summer internships in policy related roles? Um, I got lucky because I had a really good mentor in both my schools who helped connect me to the jobs that I got the opportunity to have. I would say find a professor in your school that's in policy, because that's what I really did. And she helped me connect to all of the opportunities I got. But also, just the general Googling always helps. See what other past internships students in the year before you have done and see if there's an open spot for your internship next year. The internship I did at Legislator Kara Han's place, I actually knew the person who was interning the year before, and I asked her to make sure that I get hooked up with that internship before they start searching for someone else. Really go for it. I mean, like, usually I'm shy and not confrontational, and I'm just like, I'll just accept anything comes my way. But really take advantage of like your network and folks who are doing what. And if you're interested, just do the reach out. The worst they'll say is no, but I wouldn't have gotten the opportunity unless I took the chance. So I really want to encourage that. Um, Chicago public schools have 516 school social workers, largest mental health provider. Do you have any specific advice for how to dip our toes into the world of policy? Um, I would say join a campaign as a volunteer. I started off with just volunteering for other campaigns as like a canvasser, a petitioner, and you get to know more and more people, and then you start to get an understanding of what the political world looks like. And when you get involved in the campaigning side and understanding the political side, you get a better sense of what policies people are focusing on, and you get a better network. I had a my network expanded by like 25% once I joined a campaign, because before that my network was really just my school professors and my classmates, and then whoever I knew at my internship, which helps, but really getting involved in a campaign exposes you to folks that you might not have known before. That really helped me in my personal journey. Also, Crisp's networking place, I met someone through the networking part last year that really introduced me to the field of child welfare, and now I have a job and advocating for, like against the family policing system. So take every advantage you've got. I know it's hard to say, like, there's no concrete step into joining policy. As a student, I always felt like I'm never going to get a job in policy. It's so hard, it's not possible. And then you realize, like, every opportunity you've gotten to do anything related to policy, you've already dipped your foot into policy, and people will appreciate that experience. I know, concrete. I'm the same way. I was just like, just tell me an internship to do or a fellowship that will guarantee me a job. Um, there might be a path like that. I'm not sure, but it really is just take whatever chance you've gotten. That's how it's worked out for me, to be honest. I'm not sure how it's worked out for other folks. I wish there was like a step way, but like I think working on campaigns is a really great way to expand your network, and get someone, meet folks who can really help you to get a job into the policy field, or a mentor from your school that can really connect you. It really does help. And for anyone who's going to be applying for jobs in the coming months, I mean, like, I just wish you all the luck. I know when I graduated, I was really nervous. I was just like, I have this degree in my MSW. I specialize in public policy, and I still didn't feel qualified for any jobs related to policy. I would read the descriptions and be like, oh, this doesn't sound like me. Even my current job description that I had for RISE as a policy coordinator, I applied on a whim, not really thinking I would get it because I didn't feel like I met the qualifications, because the qualifications included, knowing how to analyze budgets, which I didn't feel like I learned enough from school. I did not know how to analyze a budget. I didn't really understand how committee hearings worked in New York City because I never worked in New York City politics before. But what I really learned from this is apply for jobs that you don't feel qualified for, because you can always learn on the job. And sometimes folks don't want you to know everything on that job. They just want to know you have that people skills, and they really want to know you have that ability to understand what the issue is and be able to humanize with folks. So many folks in politics really don't have that humanizing skill that I think social workers are much better at, and it's valuable. Yeah, I empathize with you guys, but trust me, you guys are more than qualified. And I say that as someone who didn't think I was qualified. And now I'm starting this job and I'm like, oh, like, I'm really good at my job. And you guys will be good at your job too. Like, apply for anything and everything you are interested in. You have more than enough skills, especially if you have an MSW or a BSW. We have a lot more people skills than you other folks, and it makes a difference in the quality of work you do. And if anyone is taking an economics class, I highly, highly recommend listening in on that because it helps a lot in my job. Oh, I'm glad to hear, Chelsea. Any other questions from folks? Any tips on how to reflect those people skills in a resume cover letter? That is a really good question. It took me a lot of trial and error to get my cover letter to emphasize how me as a social worker is the best position for a cover letter. And I don't have my cover letter on me, but I think the way I framed it is that I have a lot of transferable skills. So my ability to come from a strength-based perspective, my ability to connect systems, and my social work ability to really humanize issues and connect day-to-day experiences to macro issues is a transferable skill that every person working in a policy should understand. Um, and really making emphasizing that all the skills you have is transferable and very important to the position you're applying for, and that being a social worker uniquely puts you in a unique position to fulfill the job duties listed in the best way possible. I really, really highly recommend framing it in a way where you know that you being a social worker puts you in the best position for that job you're applying for. Have you experienced any barriers being a female working in policy? Yes, a lot, especially because the rooms that I'm in is almost always white men. And so I first struggled with speaking out and having the confidence to speak out because everyone acted like they knew everything. And then I had to step back and realize all the things that these folks are saying are really just BS. Like what they're saying has no value. Like they'll be saying stuff like, let me see, what example can I give? They'll be saying stuff like, for example, in a budget hearing, they'll be like, we need to invest in stabilization grants because it'll help with the workforce. And then you have to understand, and then I have to sit back and realize, what do they mean by stabilization grants? How much money do we want to put to make sure that folks who are going into the workforce have enough money for childcare? Like, think back and realize what they're saying is just big words and they don't actually mean anything. Um, and so really, really making sure that you realize that a lot of the folks who are in the room don't know what they're talking about, and they're probably just there because they got lucky. And so that actually, no, I don't want to say because they got lucky, but like that you are just equally as qualified to be there. And also being a POC, it's even that much harder because I felt really uncomfortable speaking in rooms because I felt like I was being looked down on, or that people didn't really take me as like a credible person, especially because my background was in social work and people, I really have to prove to myself that being a social worker is the most valuable perspective that I can offer in my position. So really getting past that, and now I'm in a position where I'm like, I know so much more than these folks and I'm in a better position to advocate for folks than the people who are just speaking from their own perspective. Yeah, just have confidence. I promise you, like, we are more than qualified. It's just about confidence. And it took me like 3 months to get into that, but I trust me, once you have confidence in your ability, everyone will see that confidence and know you're very like capable. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I hope this was helpful. I was in your position just last year, so I know how nerve-wracking it is, and thinking about the future is so much harder, especially when you think about the world politics right now and everything feels unsure. So I empathize with you guys, and I hope you guys are able to, really see your capabilities and succeed. Maria asks, where have you gone and how have you sought support to boost your confidence? I got really lucky where I work in a only woman, like my organization is only women and it's also only POC. So we're all like black, brown, um, women. And so we're always just hyping each other up. Like we got this, we're qualified and recognizing that we're working against so many other systems. So I got really lucky that I had folks consistently reminding me how qualified I am and giving me words of affirmation in the work that I do. Find people in your network who will see what you're doing and affirm what you're doing. That helps so much, especially as you get affirmed every day. It builds your confidence rather than just seeing your work go by and no one recognizing the effort and the change that you're doing. Find a network of folks who are very affirming. And mentors. Professors make really great mentors. I got so many opportunities because of my professors. So, I mean, hopefully you guys have great professors because I know Columbia does not have some great professors, but if you have amazing professors, definitely build a relationship with them. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I really hope this was helpful. And I hope some of you guys come back as speakers next year. I can't wait to see everyone here out in the field.
All right, everybody. So we do have some more sessions coming up at the hour, but we also are finishing up our live stage right now if everyone wants to go to that. But thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today.
Thank you. Okay, I'll hang up now. I'm just gonna leave my email in the chat for folks who want to follow up, especially if you're interested in the family policing system and want to do work there. Okay, bye everyone.